Hey there and welcome to a new video. In this video I'll be taking a look at the latest updates to the Unreal Live Link plugin for Autodesk Maya. To give you a quick recap of where we are with these Live Link plugins for Maya and Unreal, a couple of months back on my channel I did a couple of videos explaining how to use this new Unreal Live Link plugin to stream data and assets from Maya into Unreal. And this plugin is a direct replacement for the existing Epic developed Maya Live Link plugin that is currently on their marketplace. However, this plugin is now being deprecated, so it's no longer being developed by Epic, and instead Autodesk have essentially taken over the Maya plugin and will continue to develop it going forwards. Now you can still get the plugin here from the marketplace, and if you go to the GitHub repository for it you can still download the actual source code, but you'll note in the readme here it actually says that this Epic supported plugin is now deprecated and has now been completely replaced by the Autodesk supported one instead. So this is fine, but of course the problem now is that this plugin was great from Epic and it went and supported Maya versions all the way back from Maya 2016 all the way up to Maya 2022, but of course in the meantime there's been a Maya 2023 and now Epic have finally launched Unreal Engine 5. Well, in this latest version of the Autodesk plugin there's now support for both, so they have included support for Maya 2023 and more importantly support for Unreal Engine 5. So if you want to stream your animation and data from Maya into Unreal 5, then this is the plugin that you will now need to use. There's also a couple of extra additions to this new version as well, which I think are really cool. The first one being is that there's now a Linux version of this plugin, so that's great. So this really expands out this capability to people using Linux, and I think that's going to be a lot of people who are working in film visual effects. And also, more importantly as well, is that Autodesk have actually released the source code to the plugin, and they've got it here in their own GitHub repository as well. So this is really good to see from Autodesk. I know they can get a little bit of a bad rep sometimes, but occasionally they do some good stuff, and this is one of those occasions, and it's really good to see Autodesk actually put this code out there for the community to take, and then they can take it, update it, and also adapt the plugin to their own particular pipelines. So all the detailed information is here. There's all information about the building of it, the coding guidelines, the license, and also how to actually contribute back to it as well. So they're very much open source this plugin going forwards. Now, if you wish to download the plugin and start using it, then you need to get it here from the Autodesk App Store. And you will need an Autodesk ID in order to log in and access the downloads, which are completely free. The reason why you'll need an ID is because Autodesk now use a named user license model, which requires you to have an Autodesk ID in order to use their products. If you go to Epic's marketplace, you will find the Unreal Live Link plugin for Autodesk Maya, but there's no downloads here. Instead, there's just a page with some information about the plugin, and then there's an external link which will take you back to Autodesk's App Store. And then the other option you have is that you can actually download the source code and compile the plugins yourself. So this is useful if you're a TD or a coder, but of course if you're neither of those and you just want the actual executable to install the plugin, then your only option of course is to go to the Autodesk App Store and access the downloads like this. Okay, so now we've firmly established the history and where we're currently at in terms of versions and supported platforms for the plugin. Let's now take a look at what the updates are in this new version. So in terms of workflow, it's still basically the same. So I'm not going to go through the entire process in this video. If you want to see how this plugin works and how it might be just a little bit different to the Epic version, then check out my two videos here on my channel and they go through the entire process. Instead, I'm just going to go through some of the small things they've added for this version and also some of the fixes that I think they've actually done as well. Now, to start using the plugin in Maya, it's very easy. Go to your file menu and there'll be an entry here, Unreal Live Link. And the first thing they've done is added support for Unreal 4 and Unreal 5. So now in the bottom left corner of the window here, if I just tear this out and make this a little bit bigger, they've got a little drop down option here. So at the moment I've got mine set to Unreal 5 because that's what I'm going to be using. But if you're still having to use Unreal 4.27, and that is going to be very common, then you can actually just choose this option here, and that will flick the plugin over to 4.27. However, if you do this, you will get this message to say you'll have to restart Maya. So be very sure on what version of Unreal you're going to be using before you then start firing this up, just to save you the trouble of having to restart Maya every single time. Okay, so one of the first things that I looked at when starting to use this new version of the plugin was an issue that I had encountered previously. And that was the inconsistency between your Maya scene and Unreal scene when your axes were set to a different orientation. Now, Unreal we know is always set to have Z or Z up, whereas Maya can be really whatever you want. It could be Z or it could be Y. Now, you may not always be in a situation where you're able to change that because pipeline issues, or that's just how your assets have been created, and you're always going to want to maintain some consistency. Now what I found is that whenever I tried to link an asset, it wouldn't always work. Ideally, if I wanted to move this signpost or this lamppost, if I move it in the Y in Maya, I want it to move in, which is going up, I want it to move up in Unreal. I want the plugin to essentially handle the offset for me, so I don't have to. I don't have to then think about doing a -90 rotation and freezing all the transformations or anything like that. I just want it to work. And the other thing I found was that it didn't like grouped hierarchies. Now this scene, if you look in my previous video, had all the assets listed in the outliner. There was no grouping or parenting whatsoever, which is okay when you've only got a very small number of assets or a very small scene. But if you've got a scene like this bistro where there's lots of individual assets dotted around, and ideally you're going to want to group things, maybe say for this lamppost or maybe the building or the scooter, then you need to have things really a lot more organized. And it didn't like it at all. Every time I grouped my assets together and linked it, it just wouldn't work. Whenever I moved the y-axis here, it would move it literally in the y-axis in Unreal, which of course would move it sideways and not up. Whereas now, I'm pleased to say they seem to have fixed that issue. So with this lamppost selected, which is now part of this grouped hierarchy, let's bring up the Unreal Live Link, add that as a selection. We now need to bring up the Live Link window in Unreal to make the connection. It's now under the window virtual production menu now, which I guess kind of makes sense. Bring up Live Link, choose my source, that's all perfectly fine. There's my exterior street light, that's all good. So now we just find our asset in the outliner and the details, add a Live Link component. There we go, choose the subject representation, which is going to be our exterior there. And that's all perfectly fine. You still get these error messages about an invalid mobility, and I think that's due to the role that's been assigned. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I'm just making a logical conclusion. Whenever an asset comes from Maya, it's given a role in Unreal, and that role helps it to define its properties and also connect them to the relevant properties under the static mesh actor. So this is given a simple transform role. There are other roles available. And I think maybe it's obviously looking for a number of properties which maybe aren't there, which is why we've got these errors. But now that connection's been established, this should now actually work. So now when I move it up in Maya, which is in the y-axis, it will move up in Unreal, which is the z or z-axis. So that's good. That's a big tick already, because that was incredibly frustrating when trying to use it in the previous version. And all the other axes work the same way. Essentially, you don't really want to think about which axis you're really moving it in. You just want to place it in a particular location. You're not having to think about, oh, is this the X or it's the Y? You just want to move it and then let the plugin handle the rest. So now I've got the luxury, I can move this around without having to think about which axis I'm actually in, or even having to freeze any transformations. So the next thing to look at was another issue, and that was to do with cameras. In my previous video, I showed you how you could link the cameras together and everything comes across fine. But again, I had some inconsistent results around the extra properties to the camera, and those are equally as important as just basic transforms. And according to the documentation, things like f-stop, the film aspect ratio, focal length and distance, which should all be supported, but I couldn't always get them to work. Now, what seems to have happened is that I don't know if there's a bug or maybe there was a slight issue, but this has now been fixed in this latest version of the plugin. I did also encounter a situation where maybe you also need to have an extra Live Link plugin loaded in Unreal. I was only using the Live Link plugin here, this one plugin, but there's also some extra plugins here, so I just turned them all on, including this Live Link camera, which could have been maybe one of the core problems that I was having. So I'm more than happy to give some benefit of the doubt to the actual plugin from Autodesk. However, with this new version, there has been some improvements, and I do think they've actually fixed a few issues with the actual process anyway. So now with the camera, one of the things you have to make sure is that you've got depth of field turned on before you establish the Live Link connection itself. And frequently in Maya, when you create a camera, the depth of field is turned off by default. So you need to turn it on. You've got your properties here. So now we can get the Live Link process going. So that's all fine. Now over it into Unreal. Just bring up the Live Link window. There's my source. That's all come across fine. What can often happen here as well is you will get some issues with the evaluation depending on whether or not you've got animation data on the camera or not. At the moment, I've got nothing in Maya. It's just a static camera that I can freely transform. And if you go to the view options here under the Live Link window in Unreal, you should be able to see show frame data, but you won't always often see anything here, and you'll get an error message that says it can't evaluate the frame. I think that's because there's no transform on it. So if I go to Maya now and just move the camera just briefly, you'll now see that's now popped up, and we can now see the details that are actually coming across from Maya. So if we look here, these all should correspond exactly with the same values that are inside Maya. So angle of view is exactly the same, focal length is the same, aperture the same, focal distance as well is also the same. So these are the values that are coming across, and we know that Unreal is actually receiving that data correctly. Now we need to place a camera actor in our scene. I'm just going to dump it in there, not even going to move it at all. And then I'm just going to assign a Live Link controller. And then assign the camera to that controller, and we should be good to go. There we go. So that seems to have worked. However, we've got a slight issue here, and that's because even though when I move the camera in Maya, there seems to be some movement here, it's not quite right. If we just see, this is what our camera sees in Maya, but this is what we're seeing in Unreal. Now the issue here is the world transform, and if you scroll down in the details of the Live Link controller, you'll see that we're accessing all the translation and rotation, but not the world transform. So if you select this, it's often turned off by default. You'll now see they'll connect up correctly, and it all seems to work. And also this camera in Maya is also grouped to an actual null as part of a hierarchy. And again, it had the same problem as before as well with static mesh actors. It didn't like the differences between Y up and Z up when working the cameras, but now that's also been resolved as well. So now when I just move my camera here, that all now works. And now we can test out the actual focal settings. So for example, here we've got this bollard in our foreground. So now we should be able to go to our camera settings in Maya. And now let's bring up our camera settings in Unreal. There you are. Its focus method is manual. Focal distance is 1000. So this is very close to the camera. So let's just change this focal distance to say 50. And now that's updating in Unreal as well. So we've got it in Maya. That seems to work. And now we can see it's also updated in Unreal. So we've got now full parity between the two. So it's very blurry because we've got an object that's very, very close to the camera. But again, if I just pull this in here to say this object camera distance is 644, so let's just go here and just put in a 650. There we go. And the focal length again will change that to say 100, or say 400 there. There we go, and that's also updated. So these values now work. Angle of view as well, we can change that slightly. And again, that's also updating live. So this is really good now. This really makes the whole process a lot easier now, especially if you're working with cameras between Maya and Unreal. Having the ability to have them update live like this is way better than it was before. So it could have been maybe my problem with not having that Live Link camera plugin loaded, but regardless of that, they've still made some updates, and I think also they've fixed the offset with the up axes as well, so that also works with the camera, because again, this is a Y up scene, the camera is Y up, and I should be able to move it and do whatever I want with it without having to think about the axis. Now, aside from the fixes, there's a couple of really small but important features that have been added to this new version of the plugin. The first one is the ability to support custom attributes and stream that data into Unreal. If you're working with a skeleton of any kind in Maya, it's often very common to use custom attributes to add specific values onto a joint or the entire hierarchy. And if you're going to stream that data from Maya into Unreal, then you're also going to want to stream any keyframes that are on that custom attribute as well. The previous version of the plugin didn't support this, but this new version now does. Give you a very simple example of how that would work. I've got the same example scene that I used before. This is the character that I've got in Unreal, or I've exported from Unreal into Maya. It's being driven by this Mixamo rig, which has been connected up via Human IK inside Maya. Now, for example, I may want to go to the hand here and actually add a custom attribute. So I go to modify, add attribute, and we'll give it a name. Just call it my value. And just OK that. So now when we go to the attribute editor and look under extra attributes, we'll see my value's been added there. I've also added another one here called my custom value, just for the purposes of this demonstration. So we've got two extra attributes on this left hand of our character. So now we want to stream our character into Unreal, and we'll say, for example, that we've got our character already in here already. So we need to establish the connection. So let's bring up our window. And again, I've got a choice if I want to, depending on my workflow or what I'm trying to do. I can just add the actual individual joint node if I want to, or I can actually add the entire hierarchy. It's really down to you how you want to work. I'm just going to keep with the entire root hierarchy for the time being and make sure we've got it set to the actual full hierarchy. Now into Unreal, let's add our source, and everything's all now come across. Now what we should be able to do now is if we select our subject name here, we should be able to now filter out all the various properties, because you can see here under the static data, these are all the names of my skeleton hierarchy. So again, if I just filter out and just put you'll see my custom value has now been added. That's now come across and has now become visible in Unreal. So that basically means that once the data's there, I can now stream it to a particular character. If you don't see it, then just scrub the timeline in Maya, because sometimes it needs an extra refresh of the data. And you notice that now I've done that, I've now got both my custom attributes have come across. If we select the hand again, we had my custom value, which is here, and then we have my value, which is there. So again, all the name of it's come across, the XYZ data's come across, and now that's there, it will connect to our character in Unreal. However, one thing you have to make sure of is that if you create the attribute on your skeleton in Maya, you're going to have to export that so you can get it into Unreal as a skeletal actor. Otherwise, it won't work. Because if I pulled in the actor now, that attribute's not on that skeleton rig, so Unreal won't make that connection. So if you've made any amendments to the skeleton in Maya, you need to make sure they're exported and then updated in Unreal, and then you can link the two assets together. Now, the other small feature that has been added to this version of the plugin is the ability to save network endpoints. And this is especially useful for those who are running multiple machines in one environment and they want to maybe stream any data on those machines into Unreal. And of course, it's going to be specific to anybody using Maya on those machines. If you go to Maya now, open up the Unreal Live Link window, and under the edit menu there's a settings option, and this is where you specify those values. So essentially the unicast endpoint, that is essentially the Unreal server that's going to act as the host, i.e. that's the server that you want to connect your Maya into. Now there's various ways that you can do this, and this is all part of Unreal's multi-user editing server environment. And you can actually specify this as well. If you go to the project settings, under the plugins and on the actual settings, you'll see there's an option here that's got multi-user editing. And further down, there's also the UDP messaging. So you can essentially set the unicast endpoint. So this could be basically the Unreal server. So you can, if you've got the Unreal server or the session of Unreal that you want to connect into on a specific machine that's got a static IP address, then you can specify that here. And then in the plugin, you can specify that also in this window here. And then at this point, the static endpoint, that's going to be the IP address of any device or hardware that you wish to connect into that server. So this would be the IP address of the actual machine that's running Maya that you wish to stream into. And again, you can just save it here. So this is really useful for those running Unreal over a network environment. Say if you're doing a virtual production session in a studio or in an actual set. It also means that you can restrict the exact number of people that you wish to allow into and stream into your Unreal server. So again, this might not necessarily be relevant to most of the users out there wishing to use this, but I think if you're in a studio as part of a larger setup and you're wishing to have multiple people stream into a single Unreal session, then you're perhaps going to like this. So overall, I'd say this is a somewhat small but still very useful update to this version of the plugin. It would have been nice to see maybe a few more features in the version of the plugin, but I think the ones they have included are still going to be of some use to many people, especially Linux support and perhaps most importantly support now for Unreal 5. I really like the fact that Autodesk have put the source code on their GitHub repository so that people can download it, look at the source code and maybe start adapting it to their own particular pipelines. And it would be really good to see people contributing back to the community and start contributing back into the development of this plugin as well. If you're coming to this plugin completely new whilst trying to use Unreal Engine 5 and you weren't aware that it even existed, then check out the 2 videos here on my channel where I go through how to set up the plugin and how to get it working in streaming assets from Maya to Unreal. And those assets will include character animation, objects, camera settings, and also timecode. In those videos, I'm using Unreal 4.27, but it really doesn't matter. The workflow is still the same, even though it's in an Unreal version 5. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.